Good evening, everyone. That was The Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov, getting us into the mood tonight for beetles and bees in literature. It's lovely to see many of you joining me here who've already been, and welcome to new people to this evening's session on Facebook and Instagram. So tonight I am channeling, as you can see, the beetle and the bee, because I've recently become aware of quite how many of these beautiful, scuttling, strange creatures with their shiny carapaces or their fluffy bodies, in the case of bees, are to be found in literature. I'm going to start by talking about beetles because it was the beetle which actually got me going down this train of thought. And it was really Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce, which I became slightly obsessed with in the last few weeks. And I thought it would be a lovely book to talk about. But before we get to Rachel Joyce, I would like to talk a little bit about other beetles in literature, such as probably the most famous beetle in literature, which is Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis short story. This was written in 1912, and it is probably one of the most short stories ever written, which is pretty amazing considering that it's only 58 pages long, and it's about a man who wakes up having turned into a dung beetle, or is it a cockroach? We never actually know. This is what Gregor Samsa says when he wakes up. In fact, it's not him literally saying it, but this is how the story is told. One morning, when Gregor Samsa woke up from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a horrible vermin. He lay on his armour-like back, and if he lifted his head a little, he could see his brown belly, slightly domed and divided by arches into stiff sections. The bedding was hardly able to cover it and seemed ready to slide off at any moment. His many legs, pitifully thin, compared with the size of the rest of him, waved about helplessly as he looked. It's a pretty shocking and hideous awakening, let's face it, and many a translator has debated about exactly what that word means in German, which is the one that's translated into horrible vermin. Some people say he's a cockroach, some people say that he's a dung beetle, and the cleaner who comes in to clean his flat actually calls him that whenever she sees him, and he desperately attempts to talk to her and scuttles one way or another, and she is of course absolutely repelled by him. And it's an amazingly compelling story from start to finish. It's one which you feel horribly sympathetic to poor Gregor as he wakes up with his strange carapace. It's not even a beautiful green one like I'm wearing, which many beetles would be proud to wear, something lovely and shiny and iridescent. He is just brown with his wavy, feely legs, and really is quite a disgusting creature. But inside, he is still the same Gregor, and he desperately tries to communicate with his family and fails. They have no idea what he's trying to say to them. They are absolutely repelled by him. And one of the many tragic things about the story is the way that he feels completely sympathetic to them in their repulsion to him. And he finds himself stuck in this hideous body, unable to talk to them. And he understands that they find him repellent. And he realizes that the only thing that he can do is slowly commit suicide and to stop eating, which is what he actually does. Poor Gregor. It's a really tragically awful, deeply sad tale, but completely mesmerizing. And why, I ask you, is it so popular, successful, and compelling? Why have so many people made that story into plays, for instance? I wonder if it's because Kafka chose the most disgusting creature that he could think of. Many people maybe would say a spider would be equally repellent, but there's something about a cockroach or a dung beetle which we find unbearably vile. The way it scuttles across the room, the way it moves its little feelers, the way it's associated with dirt, dung, and filth. And poor Gregor has absolutely no ability to get out of his situation. He even gets an apple thrown at him by his very own sister, and the apple lodges into his carapace and gets stuck, and the apple begins to rot in his back until it gives him terrible pain. The whole thing is completely unbearable to witness, but it's also darkly funny. And frankly, Kafka was in a way writing about his own life because he felt as if he was a burden on his family, and he often had enormous self-doubt and wondered what he was doing trying to be a writer. And he decided in his own way, perhaps, to commit suicide in this story. And I feel it is very much a story about his own life, but it's also one that we can all relate to. We all at times feel terribly unworthy of our own families and as if we might be a burden on society and feel like the best thing to do is to curl up and die, like Gregor actually does. But I do feel that the end of the story does give us glimmers of hope, even though it is brutal and tragic. Gregor's sister is incredibly relieved when he does finally die, and she gets up and skips off merrily into her new life, thinking that she might be able to find a boyfriend now that she doesn't have a hideous cockroach of a brother scuttling around the flat. But read it yourselves and tell me what you think. You've probably read it before, but it is one of those stories that you can go back to again and again. Before moving on to Rachel Joyce, I would like to mention another fabulous cockroach in literature, but I put down the book. Where have I put it? It's suddenly completely disappeared from my vision, which is very strange. I was just waving it around before I spoke to you. Oh, well, I can speak about it without having it in front of me. It is Archie and Mehetabel by Don Marquis. I've just found it. Here it is, which is one of my favourite collections of poetry. Hi, Colleen. Great to have you here. Thanks for coming. I am talking about beetles and bees in literature. And I've already had a little chat about Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, the terrifying cockroach in that story. But now I have a more happy and positive cockroach whose name is Archie. And this is a book that I have spoken about before in these bibliotherapy sessions because it is one of my favourite ever books, and I do recommend it to people quite often. There's a particularly brilliant poem in it called The Lesson of the Moth, which you should all read. And if you don't know about Archie and Mehetabel, Archie is a cockroach who has the soul of a poet, and he arrives in the offices of a New York newspaper one night and manages to type poetry on the typewriter that one of the journalists has left out. The only thing is he can't use capital letters because he can't use the shift key. I don't know if people remember typewriters still, but you need to have hands to use the shift key. And Archie the cockroach has no hands. He actually has to dive bomb the keys with his head in order to write his poetry. And Archie becomes a very famous and well-known poet by writing these little poems every night in the dead of night. And he is adopted by the journalist Don Marquis as a friendly bard, in the sense that he allows him to write his poetry every night. He leaves a sheet of paper for Archie the cockroach to write a poem. So I'm going to read you the first poem that Archie writes so that you can sense the flavour of these wonderful vers libre poems. Expression is the need of my soul. I was once a vers libre bard, but I died and my soul went into the body of a cockroach. It has given me a new outlook upon life. I see things from the underside now. Thank you for the apple peelings in the waste paper basket, but your paste is getting so stale I can't eat it. There is a cat here called Mehitabel. I wish you would have removed. She nearly ate me the other night. Why don't she catch rats? That is what she's supposed to be for. There is a rat here she should get without delay. Most of these rats here are just rats. But this rat is like me. He has a human soul in him. He used to be a poet himself. Night after night, I've written poetry for you on your typewriter, and this big brute of a rat who used to be a poet comes out of his hole when it's done and reads it and sniffs at it. He is jealous of my poetry. He used to make fun of it when we were both human. He was a punk poet himself, and after he has read it, he sneers and then he eats it. I wish you would have Mehitabel kill that rat or get a cat that's into her job, and I will write you a series of poems showing how things look to a cockroach. That rat's name is Freddy. The next time Freddy dies, I hope he won't be a rat, but something smaller. I hope I will be a rat in the next transmigration and Freddy a cockroach. I will teach him to sneer at my poetry then. Don't you ever eat any sandwiches in your office? I haven't had a crumb of bread for I don't know how long, or a piece of ham, or anything but apple parings and paste. Leave a piece of paper in your machine every night. You can call me Archie. And you can see from the way it's written the lack of capital letters in the book. And Archie goes on to write many, many poems which he shares with Don Marquis. And he tells the tale of Mehitabel the cat, and she has the soul of Cleopatra. And they actually make a hilarious pair and fantastic reading. They're very upbeat. And although Archie does have a difficult time being a cockroach, he is a lot of fun. So, David, thanks for mentioning The Hungry Caterpillar, which is a staple now. I agree. And that is a fantastic bug to mention. But actually, I think I'm going to save butterflies for another session. And tonight we're just going to be talking about beetles and bees. So the next beetle book, which I wanted to bring to your attention, is this beautiful book, Miss Benson's Beetle by Rachel Joyce. Rachel Joyce is famous for The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, which I'm sure many of you have read, which is a really beautiful story about a man going to visit his friend who is dying of cancer. But we won't talk about that tonight because this is her latest book. It came out this year and I absolutely loved it and have been recommending it to everyone ever since. It's all about Marjorie Benson, who is a spinster aged 46, living in London, who effectively wakes up one day having realised that her life is a hollow sham. And what she really needs to do is to go to New Caledonia in search of the golden beetle. Now, this may seem like a slightly mad quest, and indeed it is, because the book is set in 1950 and Miss Benson isn't a scientist or an adventurer. She's actually a school teacher. And for some reason, she decides to steal a pair of lacrosse boots from the headmistress on that day when she leaves her job and life and starts anew. And actually, in this way, it's a bit like The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, because the hero in that one very spontaneously goes off on a 600-mile walk. And in this one, Miss Benson, in a way, quite spontaneously, goes off across to the other side of the world to New Caledonia to find this beetle, which she began to want to do when she was just a little girl. I'm going to read you the seed of the idea, how it all begins when she's a child. Something had happened to Marjorie the day her father showed her his book of incredible creatures. She didn't even know how to explain. It was like being given... Where am I? Something to carry that she was never able to put down. One day she had said to herself, "I will find the golden beetle of New Caledonia and bring it home." And somehow also with this promise came another, far more oblique, that her father would be so happy and pleased. He too would come home, if not physically, then at least metaphorically. So we realise from that paragraph that her father has disappeared, and indeed, I won't tell you what happens to him, but he does rather tragically exit her life. And our heroine, Marjorie Benson, is from that moment as a small child when she saw a book of beautiful creatures full of amazing, unusual insects, butterflies and animals. She is obsessed with finding the golden beetle of New Caledonia, and she gives up on her dream for a few decades, partly because she meets a man, but then in her 40s she has this epiphany that she's got to go forth and do it. So she then advertises for a companion, goes through all these possible companions who are varying degrees of awful, and ends up with Enid Pretty, who is a very unlikely companion for an adventurer. She travels in a pink travel suit and a pink hat, and she accompanies Marjorie Benson on her voyage across the world on a boat, and off they go, and they make it to New Caledonia and then spend months searching for the golden beetle. And I don't want to tell you too much about what happens, but one of the things I love about the story is it is a story of female friendship, and it's the most unlikely female friendship that you could ever imagine, but it's really believable and very powerful and strong. Hi, Tracy. Thank you for mentioning the eye makeup. I'm trying to be a bee this evening, and this is my hexagons of the beehive. So I'm channeling bees and beetles in honor of tonight's theme. So getting back to Miss Benson's beetle, she does her darndest to find this pesky beetle, and it's actually well nigh impossible to find. She travels up mountains, she goes at dawn, she spends nights on the mountain looking for the pesky creature, and it's only near the very, very end of the book that she does find it. And I feel that I'm not spoiling the book for you by telling you that she does find the beetle, because there's so much that happens in between, and there's so many extreme ups and downs that I just want to share with you this moment when she does find the beetle, because it is really such a fabulous moment, and I also feel it's really beautifully written. So actually, before I share that bit with you, I just want to share another bit with you about the vocation of Marjorie Benson, of how she's so obsessed with finding this beetle, and how Enid, who becomes her friend, persuades her that she mustn't give up. This is Enid speaking. "You're behaving as if you can turn your back on your vocation, but it's not like that, Marge. It won't let you off so lightly. You're deep in this. You're in it up to your eyebrows. And you don't seem to realise it isn't like me. Your vocation is not your friend. It's not a consolation for someone you lost once, or even a way of passing the time. It doesn't care whether you're happy or sad. You must not betray it. Marge, and Gloria will not thank you, you know. It would be a terrible thing for her to bear if she learns one day that you gave up on your vocation simply for her. You saved my life, Marge. I will not let you kill yours. Enid was crying. She could not say more. But Marjorie looked at her and knew she was right. Impossible as it seemed, finding the beetle was still her vocation, and that wasn't even a question of choice. It was a terrible thing, a beautiful thing, and she had no idea any more if she had chosen it or it had chosen her. Either way, it was in her makeup. It was a part of her in the same way her blood was a part of her, and so were her hands. But that was by the by. Within a few hours, they would be in the Jeep for the last time. I won't give too much away, but this is one of the joys of the book. It's about following your dream completely, following that vocation and not giving up on it. So it is a book that I do recommend to people in terms of not giving up on what you really love, being passionate and following that passion up to the hilt. So now I'm going to read you the bit where she does find the beetle, because it's such a great moment and it really makes me want to paint a picture of it, and I want to share it with you. She was lost in a mist up a mountain, while Enid was down below in the bungalow waiting. She kept going, flailing, pushing. Then her foot came down on something razor sharp. She could feel it open like a knife through a piece of fruit. Exhausted, terrified, knowing she was defeated, but also not knowing what more to do, she stopped. She sat down. She had crossed the world to find her father's beetle, and yet here she was, behaving like her mother, a woman who'd never done anything with her life except stay in a chair. "Help me," she said. "Please help me." She didn't even know whom she was talking to. Whatever it wasn't logical. The mist didn't go immediately. She had to wait, and it felt like hours. And maybe it was only because she was staring at it now instead of fighting. But bit by bit, she could detect a movement, a thinning out, a shifting until a white ball of light emerged high above, like a blind eye that she knew must be the sun. A stone revealed itself at her foot. A blurred red shape became a flower. The mist parted, rolling back, pouring away, and the world came to life at once more. Trees, stones, a crown of blue above. She was in some kind of glade. At first she thought it had snowed. White flakes lay all around her, but they weren't snow. They were tiny frilled wax-white flowers on deep purple spikes. The bloom so small she could barely see the individual petals, with green leaves the size of her fingernail. The air smelt so sweet it was heavy. No sooner had the word orchid formed itself in her mind than she saw a flash of gold. And not one, many, clasped like tiny gold jewels to the white flowers and the green leaves and the trees above and the vast fronds and rocks, hundreds and thousands of gold beetles. The more she looked, the more she saw. They were popping out everywhere, and for the first time she had no killing jar. She didn't even have a net. She would grab one. There were enough. She scanned the clearing. As if by magic, a specimen flew down and landed on her left wrist. She stared in wonder. Tiny gold head, thorax like a gold puffy skirt, tiny gold legs, long antennae like a gold tiara. It was the most dressed up little extrovert she'd ever seen. I'm going to leave it there because it's such a fantastic, glorious moment. But you all need to read this book and get to that moment because it's so good. And that's not the end as well. There's more to come after that, and it will surprise you. So That really is the sum of the books that I wanted to talk about in terms of beetles. If anyone has other beetle books that they want to share with me, please do tell me. I know there's a lot of fantastic beetle related books for children and young adults, and they would also be fun to talk about another time, but I just wanted to focus on the adult books this evening. But I'm now going to move on to bees, and I'm therefore going to go yellow, fully yellow, so that I can talk about many bee books, some of which actually are yellow themselves. And I just want to give a little bit of background to the literature of bees, because bees have been buzzing around in literature since the time of Homer. There have been many, many poems and epic stories about bees, and bees have entered into all kinds of literature, from Chaucer to the Persian poets to Homer himself. And they're often used as a symbol or a metaphor for something that's going to help out the poet to make their point. So, for instance, in Homer, bees are described as like bees that come forth from hidden nests, who resist ferociously those who hunt them and who fight to protect their infants. So the bees in Homer are called upon as a metaphor for people who don't give up on protecting their children in times of war. And that's a very typical Homeric use of a creature. And bees have been used in all kinds of ways by poets over the years. There was a Dutch doctor who wrote The Fable of the Bees in 1705, who wrote this satirical poem, which was subtitled Private Vices and Public Virtues, which was making explicit criticisms of people in society by comparing them to bees. And he was talking about the private vices which nourish the public virtues, just as the bees do in the hive, apparently. And bees have often been used as describing people for being remarkably industrious, and for working within the confines of law, because we all know that bees in hives have very strict laws and ways of behaviour which they must not go against. And all this we will be looking at a bit more when we come to this rather fascinating book. But Sylvia Plath also wrote about bees because her father was a very keen beekeeper. She wrote a poem called The Bee Meeting, in which she said, "The white hive is snug as a virgin, sealing off her brood cells, her honey, and quietly humming. Smoke rolls and scarves in the grove. The mind of the hive thinks this is the end of everything." So that's Sylvia Plath talking about bees, and in a way talking about them in a quite sinister, quiet way. Other people have talked about bees as if they are a kind of ideal of virginity, because many of the bees remain virgins and don't procreate, of course, because only the queen is the one that can actually procreate. So some people have seen in the past that bees symbolize a kind of idealized virginity of women. There's also a lovely poem more recently written by Franco Marcoaldi, who wrote a collection called Animals in Verse in 2006, in which he talks about the rubicund beekeeper. And I'll just read you a little bit about from that poem, because it's quite a lovely poem which gets you into the mood for more bee literature. "My neighbour is a rubicund beekeeper and good-natured, a lad who tells tales of the mathematical world of the bees. He's been telling me for years, and yet every time I hear him, enchanted, as when he contends that each hive is definite proof of the clear supremacy of the insects. We are very proud of our cities, but show me one of 1,000 architects able to construct not a wall that rises, but a wall that descends. Without making a fuss, the anonymous bees have been doing it forever. Attached to the ceiling, they reach the floor, remaining suspended in their own building site, and without a ruler or a plumb line or a compass, they design hexagons of perfect dimensions, guaranteeing in this way, in the minimum space, the maximum number of identical cells. I didn't quite get my hexagons right on my face. I was doing it in my bathroom with not fantastic light. That's my excuse. So I'm not nearly as mathematical as a bee. But that poet was very much referring to the amazing mathematical abilities of the bees, which we still don't really understand how they managed to do it. Tammy, that's a good comment. Thank you. She says she's a bit worried about this doctor chap, which I kind of know what you mean, but people do tend to impose their own feelings onto bees. That's what I've noticed about the way people write about bees in literature, and people become quite obsessed with them too. So, for instance, in The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd, that is a book which I do love to prescribe to people, and I think it's a fantastic novel, which is very much about empathy and how having too much empathy can actually send you over the edge, which is what happens to one of her characters, called May, who's one of three sisters called May, June, and July. And May feels so much empathy for anyone that has any pain whenever she reads newspapers or hears stories, that she really can't bear it. And she actually writes down the messages of the people as she perceives them in the pain that they're experiencing, and puts them into a wall, which she calls the Wailing Wall. But that is all a bit of a diversion from the theme of bees. She is one of three sisters who live on a bee farm, and the story of The Secret Life of Bees is that it's about a 14-year-old girl, a white girl called Lily, whose life has been shaped around the blurred afternoon of when her mother disappeared from her life. And she lives in a house with her abusive father, who she then runs away from, with her black, no-nonsense maid, Laline, who is kind of a surrogate mother to her. This is in the 1960s in South Carolina. So we're dealing with a lot of racism here. And that's what makes the book so interesting and powerful, because the white girl and the black maid are running away together. They are really searching for Lily's mother, and they end up at this bee farm where the three sisters live. And what makes the book magical is that at the beginning of each chapter, we have a little section about what the bees do in a hive normally, and that casts its light on what happens in that chapter of the book with the humans. So the bees are reflecting the thoughts and lives of the humans around them. And it does actually paint an idyllic picture of a honeybee farm. We see the hot, heady summer with the honey being produced and the three sisters working together. But there are obviously deep, dark secrets simmering underneath the surface of the story. I would very much recommend that book, The Secret Life of Bees. A somewhat more sinister book that I'd also love to mention, which has a wonderful short story about bees, is Roald Dahl's short story collection, Tales of the Unexpected, which I feel, Tammy, you should read this, because you're just commenting that you need inspiration to start reading and you get too depressed to read them. If you read some of these short stories, they're actually great because they are short, they are dark, but they're also very funny. And in this collection, there's a wonderful story called royal jelly. And this is a story about two human parents whose names are Mabel and Albert. They have a baby. Albert is actually a bee farmer who makes honey, and he has a strange obsession with royal jelly. And it gradually becomes apparent that their baby is failing and not putting on weight. And the mother is deeply anxious and concerned. They also weren't able to have babies for about 7 years. But we realize slowly that Albert, the beekeeper, has this obsession with royal jelly. And it was when he started eating royal jelly himself that he became able to impregnate his wife. He's been studying what happens to bees when they eat royal jelly, and they, as babies, begin to put on an amazing amount of weight. They accelerate their body weight by about 500 times by eating the royal jelly. And we slowly realize that Albert has a very kind of fine golden fuzz around his face, and his legs are very short, his body is very round, and all in all, he's looking very much in a sinister way, rather like a bee. And he has started giving royal jelly to his baby, and suddenly the baby starts putting on loads of weight and being incredibly desperate for food and really rather greedy. It's incredibly sinister and a great story, and I really recommend it. And I was really pleased to rediscover this book myself, which I had in 1979. And I saw that I made comments by every single story as I read them back in 1979. It was so lovely to rediscover this book, given to me by my dear departed mum, and see all these comments which say things like horrible but funny or extremely good. I wasn't saying anything that profound at the time, but I was only 11, and I've been really loving going back to these stories, all of which have stayed with me, I have to admit, to this day. And I didn't remember them in all their details, but I did remember the bizarre events that occur and the strange things that happen. So that's another great bee story. I just want to mention in passing The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefteri, which is another great book which involves bees, but it's not, the bees are not quite so present because very sadly Nuri, who is the hero of the book, had to leave his beehives behind in Aleppo, where he has fled from to England. And in fact, his beehives were vandalized and destroyed by fire before he left anyway. His neighborhood was decimated. Friends and family were killed, including his own son. And he and his wife have now come to England. So the story of the bees for him is mostly in memory. But as the story progresses, once he's arrived in England, we do have glimmers of hope as he begins to put his life back together. And I really hugely recommend that book, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which is a lovely book. So The Bees by Laline Paull, which is the book that I keep waving around, partly because it matches my dress and face, is a strange and unique and pretty wonderful book, which people describe as a fantasy. For some reason, that word just doesn't do it for me for this book. I wouldn't describe it as fantasy, even though it is about bees. And in the book, we're actually living in a beehive. But the characters are so vivid and real that they seem completely human, but at the same time, they don't seem human because they are doing bee-like things. And that's what's so brilliantly clever and weird about the book, is that they are both avine, if that's the word, and human. They're both bee and human at the same time. So the plot of the book, in brief, is, or the premise of it is that Flora 717 is a bee who's born into the hive at the very start of the book, dramatically emerging from her waxy cell, and she is disturbingly different to the other bees. She doesn't comply with their ideals, and she's seen as a bit of a freak, and really she ought to immediately be killed, because to be different is death, and to be different is wrong and evil in their perception. But for some reason, she is saved at the last minute because one of the other bees takes a liking to her. And the whole motto of the hive is accept, obey, serve. It is a little bit like a Handmaid's Tale kind of book. Thank you, Kerry, for agreeing with me that it's a great book and we wouldn't call it fantasy. I don't know why it is often referred to as fantasy, which does seem odd. But Flora, who is this bee, but a very human kind of bee, she rebels against her fate, and she decides that she's not just going to be a worker bee. She actually has lots of ideas. She sees beyond the other rigid concepts of the bees around her. And it becomes apparent that the beehive that she lives in is possibly doomed because of various chemicals and problems that are all related to humanity, or perhaps related to mysterious goings on, which are no fault of their own. But the fertility police who rove the hive are constantly checking up on all the bees and making sure that they're not either doing the wrong thing or trying to have sex when they're not meant to, or feeding the baby bees too much royal jelly. So this is another story with royal jelly in it. And we very much get a sense of a police state throughout this book, which is really very disturbing for that reason. And it does have that Handmaid's Tale kind of vibe, as I was saying earlier. And it's really interesting because of the way that it is very feminist, and the way that the male bees are described as drones is really ridiculous. They sound like they're sort of effete Victorian dandies puffing themselves up and wanting to be noticed, which actually does make one slightly wonder about Laline Paull's view of men generally, because it's pretty dire and unflattering in this book. But actually, the female role models in the book are also pretty off-putting, generally speaking. And it is a really strange concept, the whole thing. But you do really root for Flora, and it is one of those books that's actually very difficult to put down. And I think the only reason that it hasn't become a massive hit, perhaps, is because it does have this oddity of being utterly believable in terms of the bees, and it's obviously incredibly well researched and very much based on what really happens in the life of a beehive. But then they are also quite human in strange ways. And at times, the aspects of humanity and anthropomorphism are a bit strange. So we'll be in a beehive, they're giving the babies royal jelly, and they emerge out of their hexagonal cells, but then the worker bees have little brooms to clean up the corridors of the hive, and we have wafting smells of bread every now and then wafting through the hive. So it is a bit strange. But then there's also really brilliant ideas about smell, which feel incredibly true to what it would actually be like to be a bee, in that the female bees keep wafting delicious scents over themselves and over each other, which have an immediately calming effect on the worker bees and on the babies. And they're able to just magically produce wonderful floral scents, which might be a scent to soothe and calm and sent to sleep, or they might be a scent to make the bee feel more proud of themselves, or they might be a scent to help them to feel confident. So that would be a lovely ability. And I do feel that it's maybe something that really does happen inside a beehive. So it is a very intriguing and generally fabulous and weird book, in which Flora, the heroine, becomes a kind of spy leading a double life, because she's meant to start off as just a normal kind of drone type worker bee, but she gradually takes on other roles. She becomes a nurse to the baby bees. She then becomes a bee that goes out searching for pollen. And I just want to read you a little bit of it to give you a sense of the beauty of the writing and the images of bee loveliness. Just going to have a little sip of my bee-friendly drink. The sun shone bright, and waves of sweetness poured through the air. The foragers looked at each other in amazement. In their despairing, queenless state, they had almost missed the start of the spring honey flow. Now they stood on the warming wooden ledge of the landing board. They felt the life force pull the green blades up through the soft earth and swell the buds on the branches. Corms burst below the soil, and high above it, eddies of golden pollen carried on the wind. The foragers laughed as they woke up from their sorrow. The world was come to life again, and at the glorious sound of their engines starting, more sisters came running out into the landing board. At first they too were dazed, for the grim power struggle within the hive had sapped them all of strength. But at the sight of their brave forager sisters rising up once more into a blazing blue sky, they began to cheer. The tiredness in Flora's body was a benediction of her skill, for even as she felt her joints stiffen and her engine straining, she used all her knowledge and experience to effortlessly guide her through the currents and track the finest scents. She delighted when she discovered the first narcissus in bloom, the flower every bee longed to find for its exquisite fragrance, the somewhat bland pollen being an afterthought. Its scent filled Flora's soul with such joy that she no longer felt any pain or weakness in her body. And then she foraged with all her skill and power. She found crocus and daffodil, and then pale green hebe flowers, their startling pink pollen grains plump and moist like tiny berries. She filled up her panniers. She filled her crop, and 1,000 fluorescent petals and patterns returned to her mind. She was deep in the apple blossom with the holy cord all around her when she felt the jolt in her body. That slow, steady frequency, hidden in her own pulse so long she had ceased to notice it, abruptly stopped. She whirled around as if the hive had called her. Her daughter had woken. I'm sure many of you will know that she shouldn't have a daughter because she's not a queen bee. That's one of the very subversive elements of that book, and I feel you should immediately rush out and get it because it really is a fascinating one. And I think during lockdown we've all been thinking quite a lot about bees as well, because we had our long spring and summer when we couldn't drive for quite a lot of the time and we were stuck at home, and we had a lot more experience of beetles, bugs and bees. There have been a lot more bees and wasps around, and that's a good thing. But there's also been some late stinging bees and wasps that I've experienced myself. So I wonder if anyone else has any other thoughts about bee books or beetle books. If so, please do send me an email at ellabeartu, it's ella@ellabeartu.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts about any amazing books that you've read starring bees or beetles. And I will put up a list of the books that I've talked about tonight so that you can find them. I do very much recommend the poetry as well. Archie and Mehitabel, as I said, one of my favourite therapeutic bits of poetry. And Miss Benson's Beetle is a really uplifting, positive read. And as I was saying before, I would really love to paint the picture of that moment of discovering the Beatles. So thanks so much for joining me tonight. I'll be back next week, and that will be Wednesday night again. Also on Saturday night, Halloween, I'm going to do a live reading at 11 o'clock of a spooky story. So join me for that, or catch up with it later if you're doing something else more spooky yourselves. But that will be at 11 o'clock on Saturday night, Halloween. So in the meantime, have a lovely evening. I'm going to try and send you out with some music if I can get my technology going. I think I can. So we're going to have a bit more of The Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov as I send you off into the evening. Good night.